Okay. Okay. So, basically what we learned yesterday is that if a person is engaged in hazardous activity, like he's wrestling or he's running in Rishus Harabim, and as a result of that hazardous activity, he gets injured, he cannot hold the other party liable because he was engaging in activity where he was tacitly accepting the risk. Okay, that's the basic premise. And Marv, you said that's the same thing in secular law as well. Yeah. Now, that said, I know that you have to sign. Let's say if you go parachuting or something like that, or even if you just go, what's the word I'm looking for? Paragliding, and like what do you do when you go zip lining? If you go zip lining, yeah, there's bungee jumping. But I was thinking about zip lining, which is not a relatively speaking, it shouldn't be. It's not a dangerous activity. I mean, grown-ups can do it also.
No, but I'm just saying that even young kids can.
Yeah, right. Right. I hear what you're saying.
And they just sign waivers.
So in all of these things, like even in like maybe go-karting and stuff like that, you have to sign a waiver.
Yeah.
And
in the old days, the waivers were deficient in their wording, so they'd say exclude negligence or this and that, but if it wasn't precise, like it wouldn't be covered. They wouldn't be exempt.
right, but you're basically, when you sign these waivers, you're sort of abdicating any. What if the company has a faulty zip line? Like, what if they haven't checked it in a while?
So that's reckless, and the waiver doesn't say you exclude, negligence, breach of contract, but don't say reckless. So if they characterize that conduct as reckless, the waiver doesn't catch it, so they would be liable.
I
See, that's how it's interpreted. It's interpreted very strictly in favor of the person who got injured.
Uh-huh.
So you look at it and see the scope of the wording. If it's caught in a reasonable interpretation, then they're exempt from liability. But if not, then we're good to go.
Like Mike said, a lot of those waivers aren't binding. They sign it, it's still coactive.
Well, nowadays they have the lawyers get involved in a standard waiver for all of these kinds of activities, like ski lifts and stuff like that. They're all solid. You're not going to get anything from that. Because you signed it.
But actually, who reads it though?
That doesn't matter. You sign it. If you sign it, you've taken as read. Hal's saying who reads it, but I mean, it doesn't matter whether you've read it if you sign it.
Well,
Yeah, if you're supposed to be taken to understand it, if it's on little, can't read it or it's not brought to your attention, then they say that's not good waiver either.
Right.
They have them posted and.
you have to explain it also in this sense.
Then there's kids, right? What about the kids who get injured on slopes and stuff? So the parents sign it for them, and
Right.
then there's an issue, they have their kids consent.
It's not so straightforward to get on.
That's right.
And therefore, well, Rav Shiraga's conclusion is v'lachein, based on this premise that when you're engaging in sports and other hazardous activity, you're implicitly waiving your rights to claim damages. V'lachein gam elu shesichaku b'kadur lakhu b'cheshbon meirosh she'yitachen shehakadur yifga b'fanav shel echad mehem v'al das zeh sichaku. He says it's implicit. Everyone knows that when you're playing soccer, you could get hit in the face with a soccer ball. Maybe you should take out your contact lenses before you start playing. And v'lachein hu patur. And therefore, the guy who kicked the ball in his face is going to be exempt. The real text is in this Makor Baruch. He's got a lot more stuff over here. He says, v'chein kosav b'mishpatei haTorah, v'chein kosav b'mishpatei haLevi. These are two more contemporary from, I think Mishpat HaTorah is from Rav Uziel, who was one of the chief rabbis of Israel. And he says, Vehevi Mashakosov HaBe'er HaGola. They bring something from the Be'er HaGola, who's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, who writes, V'chein pasakti l'fa'amime b'shabbatot b'chatzer beis hakneses. He says, I paskin that way also, when you let your child play in the courtyard of the synagogue, when the kids play around, they chase each other, they get into fights, the patur, that if any damage that a child incurs by playing in the shul is not liable. Ubilvad shelo yitkavnu, provided that there's no deliberate, objective of beating a kid up, right? That'll be different. If, let's say, a group of kids gang up on a kid and they injure him, so then you can hold the perpetrators liable. However, the synagogue is not going to be liable because you sort of what you end up doing is you end up abdicating your rights when you let your kid run around in the shul. You know that there's no supervision, and you know that kids are going to be running around, and you know that they may even play ball or run up and down the stairs or do hazardous behavior. You can't hold the synagogue liable. Is that, I don't think the shul's ever been sued. I'm not sure if we've ever been sued for a child getting injured. I know we've been sued in other situations where people had to slip and fall and stuff like that.
Inside synagogue or outside?
Inside, when it was inside the shul, yeah. I'm saying we're like in the hallway or in the lobby,
Even outside, it would be probably covered by the insurance policy on shul property.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
get insurance covered.
Yeah. Yeah. V'chein kasav b'sefer vayomer Yehuda. U'b'sefer vayomer Yehuda u'v'mishpatei halevi sham kasvu tam nosaf livtor et ha'mesachakim b'kadur she'iziku. They write an additional reason why, when you're playing ball, all players are not liable. Al pi ma shekasav harama, based on a Rama in Orach Chaim, Dim echad hizik et chavero mikalach simchas Purim patur ayin sham. That on Purim, because people tend to get intoxicated and they play around, then the minhag is that we hold each other not liable if things go wrong. The Gemara tells a story of two great Amoraim who were having a suda together on Purim, and one shechted the other.
Yeah.
And then what exactly?
He invited them the next year and he said,
yeah, thanks, but no thanks. Yeah. It's not clear whether that's to be taken literally, and he was resurrected or whatever, or whether it means something different. The thing.
I was going to say, Rabbi, also in the sporting activities like professional hockey, MMA, or boxing, or whatever, the usual conduct is excluded from liability because that's expected. You assume the risk by playing hockey. You're
he punched me.
But if there's an excessive hit, like you're saying, somebody really went at somebody excessively in hockey with one of those crazy, cross checks with the wood on the head or something, and then they overly, pounding the guy, that is not a voluntary acceptance of risk.
What is MMA?
Mixed martial arts,
Oh, right. Sure.
Arts,
Yeah.
Or any of these contact sports or whatever. If you act excessively beyond the pale kind of thing.
Right.
Then that's not a voluntary acceptance of risk on the victim, because I came to play hockey, not get hit in the head with a stick.
Right.
So the person would be liable.
Right.
For the conduct.
Yeah.
Same thing as an over, aggressive punch or something.
Yeah. Okay. I don't even know if it's permitted to be a boxer or one of these athletes who get into the ring according to halacha.
I was wondering about that because we spend all that time talking about plastic surgery and risks you're taking unnecessarily.
Right. Sure.
But extreme sports, is a Frum Jew allowed to, whether you can sue or not, are you allowed to expose your body to that kind of harm?
Yeah. So we haven't, I don't remember if we've seen an actual tshuva about that subject, but anything that's considered extreme, the poskim say you're not allowed to engage in. But the word extreme is a euphemism for high risk.
Right.
Because
I think I've heard that even though more people get killed in car accidents, which is But driving a car is a normal thing to do.
That's right. It's considered by society considers it an acceptable risk. Norm Macdonald had a line. He said, a nice Canadian comedian. He said, he says, there's only two outcomes when you're what's that called when you jump off of a high building with a parachute? It's called something jumping, right? And he said there's only two outcomes, either superstar or something on a rock, you know.
Right.
Uh, you know.
Yeah.
So those kinds of high risk sports, according to I remember there was a tshuva that Rabbi Tendler had issued many years ago, which makes a lot of sense. You have to gauge what society says is an acceptable risk. If society says you probably shouldn't be doing that, so then it's not permitted in halacha to endanger yourself.
There's a famous saying.
Base jumping, I think they call it.
Famous saying by a judge that someone asked him, what's the difference between negligence, gross negligence, and recklessness? So he said, negligence is you're a fool. A gross negligence, you're a damn fool. and recklessness, you're a goddamn fool.
Okay, it's a good one. Okay. All right. Umakor divrei harama. So the source, what's the source of this halacha from the Rama that if people injure themselves on Purim, they're not held liable? Umi divrei hatoisvis besukkah divrei hamasl miyat tinokos v'zelushana. He says, "V'yesh lilmod mikan laotan bachurim sherochvim basusim likrat chatan v'nilchamim ze im ze." Oh, I love it. Yeah, I remember learning this Tosfos years ago. He says, we can derive from this discussion that those young men who ride horses at a wedding feast, okay, and what is he talking about? Jousting. You know, the old sport of jousting, you know, which is the medieval sport. What would they do? They would get on horses and they would take these long lances, and they would, you know, try to knock each other off the horse, right? And whoever stays on the horse the longest is the winner, right? The Korin bigdo shel chavero o mekalkel lo suso, and if they end up tearing each other's clothing, or one guy ends up harming the other guy's horse, shehem piturim, that they're exempt. Shekach nohagu machmas simchas chasan. He says they're doing it to make merriment at the wedding feast, and so therefore it's an accepted risk. When you start jousting, you know that's what's going to happen. You know, we tend to think that you know, these kinds of sports are relatively a new phenomenon. These things have been going on for time immemorial. Even the Bali Tosfos, who lived in the medieval Europe, were very familiar that even in the Jewish community, people used to engage in these kinds of what did you call it? Not intense or intense, extreme. Yeah, everything's extreme today. V'imkein hachanami yesh lomar.
Potato chip flavor.
Yeah, right. Potato chip, extreme heat. V'imkein hachanami yesh lomar dekeven shehizik echad l'sheni mikoch mischakam patur. And therefore, over here too, because people injure themselves in the course of playing a sport, they're going to be patur. V'ayin od l'Rabbeinu hagona mechaber shlita b'shut v'haya ha'olam shegam kein pasuk al pi ha'Rama al demi shehizik chaver betoch kedei harikudim shel simchas Torah de patur ayin sham. He has the same principle, he says, when it comes to dancing on simchas Torah. Let's say, you know, there's really extreme dancing sometimes in these, you know, when you go to certain places. Here it's pretty tame, I must say. You know, Canadians are pretty tame. But if you go to like maybe a Chabad or something like that, and like they're dancing up a storm and they're, you know, really going wild, and you happen to be caught in the circle or at a wedding, sometimes guys can get carried away and they dive into each other, and they collide, and the glasses fall off, and then they get stepped on. You don't have a claim. Who told you to go into that circle of these young guys? Sometimes us old guys, we forget how old we are, and we try to get into the circle with these young guys at a wedding, and then we realize, hey, I don't think I should be here. And then we have to sort of step back. Okay. Anyway, Ulam. On the other hand, Ra'inu l'Rabbeinu Hagadol Zatzal b'Chazon Ovadia Purim shekosav delo kaimalon kaharama hanal shepasa kamoatosvus. Interesting. Rav Ovadia held that we don't paskin like that Ramah. I guess Sephardim do not paskin like that Ramah, who go like Tosfos. Ela kamo harash shecholak ala Tosfos. The Rush disagreed with Tosfos, and he held that you could be held liable for damages caused on Purim. The Chen Kosav B'Shut Harash B'Din Bachorim Rochvei Hasusim B'Simchas Chasim Shehizik Dechayev. He says that two guys who joust at a wedding, you can be held liable. Behuva B'Tur Va'od Demarin, and that's brought in the Tur. We may want to take a look at that. Va'od Demaran Beveis Yosef, Achar Shehevi Divrei Hatrumas Hadeshen, Shehabachurim Shechotfim Bepurim Ein Bazem Mishum Gezel. The Beis Yosef quotes an earlier commentary called the Trumas Hadeshen. It's one of the Rishonim, who says that when when kids grab things from each other on Purim, let's say there's Purim candy, it's lahavdil, like the trick-or-treaters. And on Purim, there's like all of this, stuff that kids have. And it was customary for them to grab from each other as part of the play. And so there's no liability for thievery on Purim, because this is just the way things go. So Kosav Beis Yosef Dahainu Dafka Liditu Dinagu Hachi. The Beis Yosef, however, qualifies that. He says that's only back in the times of the Trumas Hadeshen, when that was the accepted norm. But he says, but today our kids don't play with each other that way on Purim, and therefore you can't say, it's okay, I can just grab your stuff. Ve'en liton kimli neged mashakos maran bebeis Yosef ad kan toch devar shel Rabbeinu Hagadol b'chazon ovad yesham v'chein kasav mar berei de Ravina b'shut Rashal. I don't even know. I'm not sure what that sefer is. And I guess that's the way. Maybe he means Shut Harosh, and that's a typo. I don't know. I'm not sure. Anyway, so there are limitations on this according to other poskim. He says, "V'yesh la'ayin dihinei mashakasav Rabbeinu Hagadol deharosh cholik ala toisus hanal ayin b'sefer nechmad le'mar'eh sheharich lehochiach deharosh rak dacha et rayat hatosus mehagemara avol lo chalak aleihem me'ikar hadin." He says that's not so clear what Rav Ovadia wrote, because there's another sefer who argues that the Rosh doesn't really disagree with Tosus. He agrees that when you're a jouster, you're not held liable because you engaged in jousting, but he just says that Tosus's proof from the Gemara is not a good proof. I can disprove his proof. The Echad Meirayosov the Bekitzer Piskei Harosh Besukkah Sham Kosav Lahedja Makam Shanagu Lischok Machma Simcha Kekon Beregalo Bechuppah. He says, and the proof of that is that if you look at there's a section, the Rosh has a commentary that's printed in the back of every Gemara. And then there's something called Kitzer Piskei Harosh that's also printed in the back of the Gemara, which basically gives a synopsis of the Piskei Halacha that can be extracted from the Rosh. And in that work, it's quoted in the name of the Rosh that if you're in a place where the minhag is to be playful during a simcha, let's say kagon beregel o bechuppah, let's say using your feet to kick or to use the chuppah itself as part of the merrymaking, im ba'oso haschok hika o hizik echad lechavero, if in the course of that merrymaking you accidentally injure someone, then you're potter. Umavur lahedja de posak kehatosvus va'ayin sham od mashaherich bazeh. So that clearly indicates that even though the Rosh may have a discussion about Tosfos's proof, he nonetheless agrees with him halachically. Excuse me. Uma shehevi od Rabbeinu Hagadol raya meshut harosh shechayiv echad shechiyev echad shehizik afilu b'simchas chasan v'huva b'tur. He says what is being quoted in the name of the Rosh, who holds someone liable when he injures someone in the course of a chasana, where there's lots of merrymaking. Hine hama'ayin b'tshuva sham yira d'lo irish shehizik derech simcha. Ela she'echad mechaverei hachatan ratza l'lechad l'darko ubeli kavana hizik lepered hachatan ayin sham. He says it's not that the injury over there was caused while they were dancing or jumping around, but rather one of the chassan's friends wanted to leave, and as he was leaving, he injured the chassan's parrot. I think it means his mule. And in other words, it was in the course of his leaving the wedding that he injured the mule of the chatan. The imkain kevin shalohaya hezek miderech simcha lachein chiyavo harash. In that case over there, the Rosh held him liable not while he was in the midst of merrymaking, but because he was in the process of leaving the wedding. That's why the Rosh held him liable. The Gama Taisus Harama Yodu, the Chayiv B'chihai Gavna. And so therefore there's no reason to argue that there's a machlokas here between the Tosfos and the Rosh, because the Rama and Tosfos would agree to that. When you attend a wedding, if you're already in the parking lot after the wedding's over and you accidentally hit someone in the parking lot, right? You can't say, oh, it was in the course of merrymaking, I had a couple of drinks and everyone knows that when you go to a wedding, people drink. You can't make that argument. That's not a valid argument. Shuv ra'isu shekain kasav hakneses hagadol lehedja. V'hosef l'dayakein medivrei hashulchan aruch shepasak es shuvas harosh anal v'lo kasav da'ari b'simchas chasan. V'gam harama sham shehevi es divrei hatoisu shepoter behezek machmas simcha lo kasav divreim b'loshen cholek ala shulchan aruch mashma shehevin b'das hashulchan aruch shegam hu model lezeh ayin sham. He's basically quoting all of these authorities who basically say the Rosh is talking about a totally different case, and there's no reason to understand it as a machlokes. Okay, we'll skip to the next paragraph. Umashikasav Rabbeinu Hagadol de Mehabeis Yosef Muchach Shalosvir Leke Hatruma Sadeshen Vaharei Anan Kibalnu Haraos Maran Afilu Mashikasav Bebeis Yosef Ichule. He says, and to respond to what Rav Ovadia writes, that he disagrees with the Truma Sadeshen, he says, La'anias daiti lo hevanu ma'hechach lomar kein bedas mara. He says, I don't really understand how you can say that the Beis Yosef is disagreeing with the Truma Sadeshen.
Repeat, what's a Truma Sadeshen?
The Truma Sadeshen says that if young boys, boys grab stuff from each other on Purim, you can't hold them liable for thievery or damage. So he says, it's not that the Beis Yosef, he says, I don't think that the Beis Yosef disagrees with that. The Beis Yosef rakasav sham sha'anan lo nahaginan lachtov oichel bepurim. L'chein l'didan en chiluk bein purim l'shar yemos hashana. All the Beis Yosef writes is that our minhag today is not to grab from each other. And since that's not the minhag, if a guy does that, he will be held liable for stealing. But if for whatever reason it becomes the minhag that people grab stuff from each other, so then we will agree with the Truma Sadeshen. And he says, and it's really indicated from what the Beis Yosef writes. He says, as far as this matter, really, there's no difference between Purim and any other day. It sounds like the Beis Yosef will agree that when it comes to issues of injury, we would agree that Purim is unique and that, sometimes people bump into each other and stuff. V'imkei me'achar de'ein hechrech b'das maran, vadai yochol hamuchzak liton kimli kedas harbi poskim, shekasvu liftor mishi hizik mikoach simcha. And therefore, since there's no way of knowing, since there's not that there's no way of knowing, but since it doesn't seem that the Beis Yosef is disagreeing with the Trumas Hadeshen, there's no reason to say, he says, certainly a person could say, well, I hold like the Ramah, and the Beis Yosef seems to hold that way as well. And so many other Sephardic poskim hold that way. Ein lakneses hagdola v'chein kasav hagrach palaji b'shut leiv chayim v'chein kasav b'sefer nechmad l'mareh v'chein kasav rav mishkenos haroim de potter va'od dechol chele de Rabbeinu hagadol hayim imashe kasav habeis David the das maran de lo kahatosus v'beis David atzmo b'chelik beis kasav da mufsag yocholiton kimli. Okay, he's basically going through a whole bunch of different sources to explain why the halacha is consistent with the Ramah, and therefore anybody who causes damage in the course of jousting or aggressive dancing or on Purim could say, well, I hold like the Ramah. He says, ubifrat, and then I'll go even further. He says, the yesh lahosif the afal pisha rabbeinu kosav de'em liton kimli negin masha kosav maran bebeis Yosef mikol makom das kama poskim hidefshul liton kimli negin masha kosav maran bebeis Yosef imoviu b'shulchan aruch. Furthermore, he says, even though normally, if something is not codified in the Shulchan Aruch from Rav Yosef Karo, but he writes it only in his Beis Yosef commentary, the Rav Yosef Karo wrote the Beis Yosef commentary on the Tur, which was the precursor to the Shulchan Aruch, and then Rav Yosef Karo in the 16th century wrote the Shulchan Aruch, where he basically extracted the final psak halacha based on what he wrote in the Beis Yosef. Sometimes there are things that he leaves in the Beis Yosef that he doesn't transfer over to the Shulchan Aruch. And so his argument is like this: even though normally a person can, especially if you're Sephardic, you cannot go against the psak of the Mechaber in the Shulchan Aruch. But if it's something that Rav Yosef Karo only wrote in the Beis Yosef but didn't transfer it over to the Shulchan Aruch, you could say, I don't paskin that way, I paskin like somebody else. V'chemoshe kosav Rabbeinu hagona mechaber shlita b'shut baruch oimer, v'chein kosav Rabbeinu hagadol gufei, v'chein nira me rehitas devarav b'shut yabia oimer, ela shenira she besof Chayev Chazer Bo Svir Leidein Lito Negin Mashakos Maran Bebeis Yosef Mashakos. Okay, all right, etc., etc., etc. Umikol Mako, and the bottom line is, he says, Mashapasek Rabbeinu Hagadol Bechazon Avad Yapurim Sham Dim Echad Hishtaker Vehizik Lachavero Dechayev. He says, even though Rav Ovadia paskins that if a guy gets drunk on Purim and he ends up injuring someone, that he's going to be held liable. He says, is that inconsistent or consistent with what the Ramah writes? He says, Nira debichi gavna gam haRamah yodeh dechayev. But I feel that even the Ramah will agree that if you get so drunk that you start swinging, taking punches in the air and you end up hitting somebody, even the Ramah will hold you liable. Kevin dezelo doima l'shnaim shesichaku yachad vehiziku mitoch simcha. He says that's not like a typical case that the Ramah is talking about, where two kids are playing, like they're jousting, or they're playing they're dancing in a circle, and two guys, one plays the matador and the other one plays the bull, and they start pretending that they're, and all of a sudden a kid, by accident his glasses fall off and he steps on them. He says that's what the Ramah was talking about. But if a guy gets so drunk that he becomes violent and someone gets injured as a result, even the Ramah will agree. But if a drunkard starts injuring people because of his lack of control of his body, he says that he's going to certainly be chayav. For Choshen kosav b'yam shel Shlomo, And that's the Maharshal says that, Shuvra Isa Sheken Kasa B'Shari Mishpat, and that's where we'll hold it for today. So that concludes that shuv.
Civil law, being drunk doesn't make you exempt from liability.
Well, it's interesting, I mean, intoxication is a defense to intentional torts sometimes. They were so drunk, I didn't know what I was doing, so you don't
Yeah.
have volition, but you get nailed for getting drunk, right? Like negligence.
Yeah, especially like if you're in a vehicle, right? I have a wonderful Shabbos, everybody,
Shabbat shalom.
and Shabbat Shalom, and let's hear good news from Israel. Okay. Yeah, we'll send you the